You're listening to Boring History for Sleep, Why Medieval Castles Had Indoor Beehives and Bat Closets. Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a quiet walk through the shadowy stone corridors of a medieval castle, but we won't be alone. Above your head, wings flutter softly. Behind a tapestry, something buzzes. And no, that's not just your overactive imagination whispering ancient secrets into the dark. This isn't one of those dramatic castles with ghostly knights and flaming arrows. No, this one is oddly cozy in its weirdness. It smells of damp stone, melted wax, and something faintly sweet like honey that's been hidden too long. You'll run your hand along a rough wall, and maybe, just maybe, feel the gentle warmth of a hive tucked inside a niche. Because yes, bees lived inside castles. So did bats. Intentionally. You probably won't survive this if you're allergic to bee stings, but hey, at least you'll look noble in the afterlife. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, leave a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. I love seeing how global our sleepy little community is now. Dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge softly along the inner wall of a keep, where torch sconces have long been replaced by the glow of imagination. There's a hollow alcove where cold air seeps through, and tucked within is a small wooden box with a slit in the bottom, an old bee bowl, designed to house a These bee bowls, built right into castle masonry, allowed bees to safely come and go, while the hive itself stayed warm and protected. Not exactly what you'd expect inside a fortress built for war. The medieval mind, though, didn't compartmentalize life the way we do. A castle was not just a military stronghold. It was a home, a monastery, a court, a farm, and in this case, a surprisingly bustling apiary. Historians still argue whether these hives were more for wax, honey, or simple superstition, but the truth is likely a mix of all three. You imagine yourself pausing near the alcove. It hums with low vibration, like the back of a cat's throat. The bees, if undisturbed, are oddly calming, medieval ASMR, if you will. In an age before refrigeration, sugar, or electricity, honey wasn't just a sweet treat. It was essential. It preserved fruit. It flavored porridge. It even dressed wounds, and wax. That golden byproduct lit chapels, kept letters sealed, and made everything smell faintly divine. The castle's inner architecture adapted around this. You picture thin slots in the wall, not for arrows, but for bees. Some builders even embedded hives into the thickest walls to help regulate winter warmth. The bees would come and go from the outside world, oblivious to their noble surroundings. One record from a 13th century estate inventory listed 6 hives in the chapel wing, a quiet testament to how normal this was, and they weren't always tucked far away. Occasionally, a hive might be placed near a lady's solar private chamber full of cushions, embroidery, and tapestries, where noble women escaped the cold and the men. The gentle buzz was thought to inspire calm, or maybe just drown out the clamor of servants arguing about eel pie. Here's a tidbit that'll stick with you. Bees were considered royal. Monarchs often likened themselves to queen bees, nurturing, fierce, the center of order. In fact, Charlemagne's court was obsessed with bees, and centuries later, Napoleon would adopt the golden bee as his symbol. In some castle designs, beehives were even decorated with little crowns. Because, if you're going to keep insects in your house, you might as well lean into the aesthetic. You reach a landing and glance down a narrow spiral stair. A gust of warm, slightly funky air wafts up. You wrinkle your nose. That, dear listener, is the scent of mixed-purpose honey, wax, and probably bat guano. We'll get to the bats soon enough. But first, look at the wax candles mounted along the hall. In many medieval castles, beeswax was so prized, it was stored in locked cabinets. Tallow candles made from animal fats smelled like old soup and burned smoky and fast. Wax, on the other hand, burned slow and clean. It was light fit for a chapel or a queen's bedchamber. And during feast days, those golden flames turned stone halls into something nearly celestial. There's even a record of a Yorkshire castle that employed a full-time wax steward, not just a candle maker, but a guardian of all things waxy. His job included inspecting hives, testing purity, and, occasionally, defending the bee bowls from overly curious falcons. Now you might be wondering, didn't the buzzing bother people? Wouldn't someone complain? Sure, probably. But then again, this was a world where a decent mattress was a sack of straw, and your neighbor might be boiling pig fat 2 doors down. A few bees in the hallway. That was practically ambience, and for many castle dwellers, the gentle buzz meant safety. Bees were believed to warn of intruders. Their sudden silence could be an omen of plague, and some whispered that bees carried news to the dead. More than once, a noble family would announce births, deaths, and weddings directly to the hives, just to be safe. Weirdest of all, some castle bees were given names, like pets. There's one slightly bonkers tale from a French manor where a lady named her bees after saints, and claimed they answered her prayers. Historians still argue whether she was touched by faith, or just touched. You move further now, deeper into the guts of the keep, and you notice the temperature drop. The scent of honey fades, but not entirely. It lingers, like the memory of something you can't quite place. And for a brief moment, in the echo of your steps, you imagine the sound of thousands of tiny wings beating behind the stones. Because in this strange little corner of medieval life, castles didn't just protect people, they protected bees. You keep moving through the stone quiet, following a corridor that narrows slightly, then opens into a rounded chamber, with a slit of sunlight filtering in through a deep-set window. It glints off something golden, resting on a carved wooden stand-a-skep. Again, but this one is more decorative than practical. And right beside it, a low wooden bench, with thick cushions, faded by time but still whispering wealth. You've just entered a solar. A solar, in a castle, is where high-born women spent much of their private time. It was warmer than most rooms, elevated above the drafty lower floors, and reserved for embroidery, quiet conversation, and, apparently, beekeeping. Sort of. It wasn't uncommon for noble women to keep a hive nearby, not just outside the window, but sometimes inside the wall adjacent to the solar itself. Why? Because honey wasn't just a sweetener or a healer. It was a beauty essential. Imagine dipping your fingers into a delicate pot of honey and rosewater face paste. You gently apply it, smoothing it over your skin while a handmaid braids your hair. The bees are humming softly just a few feet away, sealed safely behind stone and wood. You don't worry about being stung, just about maintaining the kind of luminous complexion your portrait painter will adore. Honey, in medieval skincare, wasn't some fringe practice. It was in everything. Face balms, hand salves, perfumed waters, a lady's vanity table lift. She was lucky enough to have one would have looked like the inside of a beehive exploded and landed in a rose garden. There are surviving records of recipes from 14th century England and France for honey-based youth elixirs, including one that called for honey, egg white, and ground pearl. Historians still argue whether these actually worked, or just made your skin feel like a sticky meringue. But let's be honest, in a world where hygiene was optional and sewage was freestyle, honey probably was doing you a few favors. And honey wasn't only for skin. It was mixed with herbs and rubbed into the scalp, dabbed onto the lips. And occasionally, though you may want to sit down for this, used in a sort of proto-deodorant. A blend of honey and vinegar was dabbed under the arms to fight body vapors. Very romantic. You pause now by a hanging tapestry, showing a noble woman surrounded by flowers and birds. If you look closely right there, near the bottom edge, you'll spot something odd. a cluster of golden insects stitched beside her hand. Those are bees. This woman wasn't just hanging out with peacocks and lilies, she was likely being portrayed as virtuous, fertile, or divinely protected. Bees carried all sorts of symbolic weight. In religious terms, bees were sacred. Monasteries kept hives by the dozens, and beeswax candles were required for sacred rituals. But even outside the cloister, bees represented harmony, order, and feminine power. That's part of why they turned up in these odd corners of castle life, tucked into solars and boudoirs, and sometimes they were just there, wandering. A young handmaid might find a stray bee resting on the stone floor, sluggish from the cold. She'd scoop it up gently, whispering a small prayer, because bees weren't to be killed. To harm a bee, especially near a hive, was thought to bring terrible luck. There's even a record of a noblewoman in Cornwall who insisted that bees were little monks, too holy to harm. She'd set up tiny drinking bowls with sweet wine near her windowsill. Her servants hated it, of course. Bees plus drunk bees plus velvet drapes is not a winning formula. But this reverence, this intentional proximity, wasn't limited to women. In some households, the master of the keep would have a hive sealed behind the chapel wall. He could hear them buzz during his morning prayers, a low murmuring choir of wings. Imagine that for a second. You kneel in a candlelit chapel, and just behind the wall, a hive hums in sync with your psalms. The incense smoke curls. The wax glows golden. Somewhere above, stained glass filters morning sun onto both your folded hands and the secret lives of bees. Of course, not everyone was thrilled about indoor hives. One castle steward's ledger, from northern Germany, notes a formal complaint from a visiting baron who awoke to find 2 bees upon his curtain and 1 on his forehead. The steward diplomatically blamed the wind. The bees, presumably, were unbothered. Still, beehives were kept intentionally near warmth and light, to things that were rare and precious in medieval interiors. High castle windows often had no glass, just wooden shutters, or at best, stretched parchment or horn, so a south-facing wall was a premium spot for hive placement. Now here's a slightly unhinged tidbit for you. Some castle owners kept personal bees. These weren't exactly pets, but they were familiar, and some people claimed to recognize individual bees by their behavior. One particularly eccentric countess had a hive labeled with little painted names: Beatrix, Alda, Honora, a whole buzzing sorority. Historians still argue whether this was genuine affection or just an early sign of too much mead, and there were darker superstitions too. Some believed that bees could sense sin. If a beekeeper had committed a moral offense, say lying about taxes or flirting with the cook, the bees might stop producing, or swarm into the chimney, or just disappear, gone without a trace. You can imagine the panic that caused. In one recorded case, a nobleman held an apology ceremony for the bees. So you're sitting there now, on that low-cushioned bench, in the solar, listening to the distant hum behind the wall. Maybe there's a bowl of dried figs on a low table, and a small dish of lavender honey golden thick, a little dusty from stone dust in the air. You dip your finger in and taste it. It's slightly smoky, a little herbal. You realize it's probably laced with thyme or rosemary, common additives at the time, both for flavor and supposed health. And as the sun shifts and the shadows stretch, you notice something flutter past the window, not a bee this time, but something darker, a bat. That's not just an accident, because in this castle, bats are just as welcome as bees. The bat skims past the window again, a blur of wings that disappears as quickly as it came. You pause, halfway between curiosity and a shiver, and then somewhere above you a tiny rustle. Not the creak of a rafter or the clatter of wind against the shutters, but the soft, leathery shuffle of something alive, something ... hanging. You're not alone. You glance up. The ceiling of this narrow stairwell, lined in aging wood and soot-stained stone, is peppered with tiny shadows. and if you squint better not squint. That makes them lull, make out a few dangling bat bodies, upside down and utterly unimpressed by your presence. Welcome to the belfry, or the turret, or the latrine loft, because in medieval castles, bats showed up in all sorts of places, and weren't always chased away. In fact, some castles had rooms designed to attract them, not with velvet curtains and a cheese plate, obviously, but with nooks, crannies, and cozy eaves that offered perfect shelter. These weren't bat caves. They were more like bat closets, warm, dark, protected from the wind, and most importantly, with one of their favorite things, bugs. A medieval castle was paradise, if you were winged and nocturnal. Historians still argue whether bats were intentionally kept or simply tolerated, but there's growing evidence that their presence wasn't just accidental. There's a 15th century document from a castle in what is now southern Germany that refers to a Fledermauswinkel, literally bat corner. It was supposedly kept unlocked and unlit, and the steward mentioned in the margin that it was fortunate for keeping moths from the linen. So yes, bats were, in a roundabout way, part of pest control, and speaking of linen, moths were a nightmare. In a castle, fabric wasn't just clothing, it was wealth. Tapestries, cushions, garments, bed hangings, altar cloths, even wall insulation, all of it could be devoured by insects. But bats loved moths, and beetles, and gnats, and the occasional daring mosquito. In short, they were furry little exterminators that worked the night shift. You tiptoe up the stairs now, careful not to disturb the residents above. There's something humbling about bats. They don't care who you are. They don't blink. They don't even use their eyes. They operate entirely on sound, like some kind of organic sonar system that says, you are irrelevant, human, which, in this moment, is fair. And they weren't just tolerated for their pest-eating habits. Bats had a bit of a mystique. In some parts of medieval Europe, they were considered lucky. A bat flying into your home might mean money was coming, or marriage, or depending on which century and which region, death. You know, the usual medieval gamble. One particularly quirky tradition comes from Wales, where it was believed that if a bat circled a castle 3 times before dusk, someone inside had told a lie that day. Bats as lie detectors. Sure, why not? This was also an age when people blamed headaches on bad air spirits and thought sneezes needed to be exorcised. But back to the castle. You reach a wooden landing. Above you, the rafters stretch like the ribs of a giant, all blackened and curved with age. Here, in this half-forgotten attic chamber, the bats cluster. It's dim, dusty, and deeply quiet. You can hear your own heartbeat. There's guano on the floor, soft, grayish powder that smells faintly of old fruit and faint horror. And here's a truly odd tidbit. Medieval physicians sometimes used bat droppings, mixed with herbs and wine. Guano was believed to treat ailments ranging from epilepsy to gout. There's a 14th century Italian text that suggests applying bat droppings to the temples during a full moon to calm nervous fits. Historians still argue whether this was satire, translation, error, or just wishful thinking. Guano was also mixed into poultices for bruises, cracked skin, and brace yourself certain medieval versions of toothpaste. Supposedly, when ground fine and blended with sage, it brightened the teeth and gladdened the heart. I mean, it's technically organic. You might be wondering why nobody just removed the bats. Well, that brings us to another point. Castles were drafty, really drafty. The idea of sealed rooms didn't exist yet. No insulation, no caulking, and windows that let in more air than they kept out. So creatures just got in. And once inside, if they weren't actively biting someone or nibbling on manuscripts, they were often left alone. But some people wanted them there. There's a curious tale from Bohemia about a minor noble who built a turret specifically for bats after his son recovered from illness. He claimed the child had been guarded by the watchers and wing. He carved little bat symbols into the stone and commissioned a ceiling mural of St. Francis's blessing the animals, including a particularly awkward bat painted near a donkey. Now, you're backing slowly down from the rafters, careful not to crunch guano underfoot. You return to the stairwell, where the light is just a little brighter, and you think, maybe, these bats were the night watch. Silent guardians of the keep. Yes, they were creepy. Yes, they pooped. But they also kept the fleas and moths at bay. And in a medieval castle, that counted for a lot. Plus, they probably made a great excuse. If a lady screamed in the night, she could always blame a bat fluttering near her bed curtains. Or a bat could be blamed for knocking over a wine cup. Or for that scratching noise near the chimney. Definitely not ghosts. Nope, just bats. As you head back into the corridor, you can still hear the faint rustle above. A sound you might once have feared, but hear now. It's oddly soothing. Like rain tapping on the roof. Like wings folding in sleep. The bats are part of this place. Part of the walls. The history. The hush. And tonight, they're part of your story too. You step softly out of the stairwell, back into a long hall that seems to hum with layered sounds. There's the low memory of buzzing faded now and the gentle creak of timber above. Your eyes are drawn to the windows, or what passes for windows here, narrow slits or thick opaque panes, patched together with materials that barely qualify as transparent, because real glass, that was a luxury. Most medieval castle windows used horn, oiled parchment, or thin slices of alabaster. But occasionally, if you were wealthy or very pious, you might have something better, something golden, beeswax. Wait, beeswax. In windows. Sort of. Let's walk slowly here. The truth is, while beeswax wasn't literally used as the main window pane, it did play a huge part in sealing and polishing materials used for light diffusion. Thin sheets of horn, when treated with oils and beeswax, could become slightly translucent. Not crystal clear, more like looking through yellowed fingernails. But enough to let in the ghost of daylight while keeping out the wind. You run a finger gently along a warm sill. The air smells faintly of wax and old stone, and the memory of honey lingers in the cracks. The room you've entered now is one of ritual and record, a small chapel annex, or maybe a writing room, a scriptorium where monks or clerics copied manuscripts by hand under the soft flicker of candlelight, and those candles, made of beeswax, naturally. Tallow candles, those from rendered animal fat, were for kitchens and dungeons. They smoked, they sputtered, and they smelled like burned soup bones. But beeswax, that was the good stuff. Clean burning, subtly scented, and able to hold a flame without dripping wax, like an overdramatic teenager. In this chamber, the glow is soft and golden, casting gentle shadows over parchment and quill. You picture a monk hunched over a wooden desk, tongue sticking slightly out in concentration, writing in precise Latin script, while a single beeswax taper flickers beside him. The silence is complete except for the scratching of the pen and the occasional soft flutter above. Because guess who's here, too? The bats. Yes, even in places of scripture, the little winged lodgers found their way in, especially in castle chapels and attic libraries, where the eaves made for ideal roosting spots. Imagine reading a psalm while a bat does laps around your head. Holy inspiration or distraction from divine duties. Historians still argue whether bats were seen as sacred protectors or simply tolerated nuisances. Still, there are records of clerics believing bats were drawn to sanctity, or at least to the warmth and bugs near sacred spaces. In one particularly charming 12th century anecdote, a monk describes a bat joining vespers by fluttering above the choir and bowing mid-flight. You can't make this stuff up. Well, someone did, but they were very earnest about it. Now, let's talk wax seals. You know the image. A rolled scroll, tied with ribbon, stamped with a ring, into a blob of colored wax. Beeswax, of course, often dyed with ochres or crushed berries. Those seals weren't just for show, they were the medieval equivalent of a password. Break the wax, and someone knew the letter had been read. But here's where it gets quirky. Some seals had tiny, pressed symbols within them: bees, bats, or winged creatures that stood in for names or titles. One scribe, in 14th century Flanders, was nicknamed Bat's Quill, and signed his letters with a little winged emblem made from a carved nutshell. It's strange, but also kind of delightful. You notice a wooden chest in the corner, partially open. Inside are rolls of waxiettes, beeswax used for everything from sealing scrolls to coating tablet covers for writing practice. And if you peer closer, you'll see a faint imprint on one, a bee, mid-flight. Whether for decoration, superstition, or branding, no one's quite sure. Now let's go back to the windows for a moment, because castles, despite their grandeur, weren't bright places. Most rooms relied heavily on candles or firelight, which meant beeswax production was constant and crucial. Larger estates often had their own dedicated apiaries, rows of hives tucked near the outer walls or within protected gardens. The wax was harvested, strained, and formed into rough bricks for transport and storage. But it wasn't just lighting they worried about. Some castle residents used beeswax to waterproof items, shoes, scrolls, even the undersides of wooden bowls. When mixed with oils or lard, it formed a surprisingly resilient coating. There are reports of soldiers waxing the seams of their leather armor before battle to help deflect water or, optimistically, arrows. Historians still argue whether it was effective or just messy wishful thinking. Meanwhile, bats found their own niche in the domestic economy. Besides pest control and spiritual cameos, they served one more very practical purpose. They fertilized things. Bat guano, rich in nitrogen, was harvested and sometimes stored, yes, indoors in designated alcoves or jars. If that sounds horrifying, it was, but also effective. The castle's small herb garden probably thrived on bat droppings long before anyone invented the phrase organic compost. You imagine a steward carefully scooping guano into a clay pot, muttering about how nobles always want more time in the soup and don't ask where it comes from. His assistant, probably holding the torch and praying not to drop it. You move now toward a heavy wooden door at the end of the hall, worn smooth by generations of hands. On the other side is a smaller tower room, where a cold draft hits you square in the face. This, you realize, is a former storage chamber. Stone shelves line the walls, and on one of them, balanced with perfect indifference, is a single dead bat, just hanging there. Not in a dramatic way, more like a crumpled sock, but it reminds you of something important. These creatures lived and died in the walls, in the corners, in the attics. Their presence was not theatrical. It was just life. Messy, winged, slightly gross life. The same goes for bees. Their wax-lit letters that changed dynasties. Their honey sweetened the bread of queens. Their wings hummed lullabies into the bones of ancient keeps. You sit for a moment on the stone floor, your back to the cold wall. There's a faint mark beside you, waxy residue, maybe, or a centuries-old smudge from fingers long forgotten, and in that stillness, surrounded by echoes and hums, you realize this castle breathed. It wasn't silent. It wasn't sterile. It was alive with buzzing and fluttering and flickering gold, and oddly enough, that life came with wings. Your path now winds downward, slow descent into the underbelly of the keep, where the walls thicken and the temperature dips. You duck through a low archway, stones worn smooth from centuries of boots, paws, and who knows what else. The air turns dense. Not musty, exactly, but mineral-rich, with the lingering scent of dampness and something sweetly sour faintly fermented. It's the smell of storage, of preservation, and, apparently, of subtle biological warfare. You've just entered the castle's food cellar, or more accurately, one of them. These chambers weren't just for barrels of meat and root vegetables. They held secrets, some edible, some less so. Let's talk honey first. It wasn't kept in quaint glass jars with gingham lids. No, medieval honey was stored in clay pots, corked with wax or wood, and often buried halfway into the cool earth floor to keep it from spoiling. You spot one such pot, now half sunk, rim-crusted with sticky residue. A buzzing memory sealed under a film of wax. And this, honey, it wasn't just for bread and porridge. It was a weapon. See, castles weren't just homes, they were fortresses. And when under siege, anything could become part of the defense plan. That included bees. Picture this. The enemy is scaling the walls, shouting, clanking, trying to breach the gate. And suddenly, from a narrow parapet, a soldier heaves a clay pot over the edge, not of oil, not of boiling water, but of angry bees. Because yes, tossing live hives at invaders was a documented, slightly chaotic form of castle defense. Historians still argue whether this tactic was widely used or just a handful of wonderfully vengeful stories, but it appears in several medieval accounts. One German fortress supposedly kept hives on the battlements and trained guards to use long poles to encourage bees into frenzy before launching them skyward in siege baskets. The phrase weaponized bees has never felt more literal, and it gets better because bats had their moment. 2. Enter the flying firebomb. There's a bizarre story out of Eastern Europe in the 13th century involving a group of defenders who allegedly tied burning cloth to bats and released them toward an enemy encampment. The hope was that the bats, seeking warmth and darkness, would fly into the thatched roofs and set them ablaze. Now, was this brilliant? No. Did it work? Not really. Bats, as it turns out, are not reliable pyromaniacs. Most of them just burst into flame mid-air or flopped dramatically onto the grass. Still, it's a testament to medieval ingenuity and desperation, because in a siege, nothing was off the table or off the rafters. Back in the cellar, you spot a wide, shallow basin crusted with honey remnants. This was once a mixing bowl for creating what might have been the castle's closest thing to energy bars, crushed oats, dried fruit, nuts, if you had them, and generous globs of honey, rolled into balls, pressed into cakes, or packed into travel rations for messengers. Protein before protein was cool. But not everything in this chamber was meant to nourish. In the corner sits a sealed jar. Its label is long gone, but the smell is distinct, sharp, astringent. If bees gave life, bats gave a little something else. Guano, yes. Again, but this time, it wasn't for gardens. It was for walls. Guano mixed with lime and sand created a surprisingly strong mortar filler. Not every castle used it, but where limestone was scarce or mortar needed patching, bat guano came into play. Some builders swore it kept away damp rot. Others just liked that it dried fast and held strong. You run your hand along the wall, rough, gritty. Perhaps somewhere in this mix is the quiet echo of 1,000 flapping wings. And now, the strangest weapon of all, honey smoke. When enemy soldiers managed to light fires near a castle's wooden structures, defenders sometimes fought back with thick clouds of honey-scented smoke. Burning old hive debris, or even honey itself, released an acrid, cloying fog that confused invaders, and, more usefully, masked the movements of archers and guards. It's the world's first recorded use of medieval fog machines, and probably the last time anyone said, "Smells like burning sugar," while dodging arrows. You can almost imagine it, a desperate night, the walls shaking, and a guard lighting a bundle of dried comb to cloud the stairwell in ghostly golden haze. The bees would have hated it. The bats would have flown in panicked circles. And through it all, The castle lived, adapted, fought with what it had. Back above ground, now. Your footsteps echo in a different chamber, this one higher up, filled with arrow slits and murder holes, a defensive gallery. And here, tucked in the eaves, a nesting cluster of bats, completely at ease. They knew their job, and remember, bats weren't just stealthy flyers. Their droppings held other, weirder uses. In some particularly superstitious circles, bat guano was believed to ward off witches. Smearing a bit over a doorframe or chimney was said to confuse evil spirits. So during a siege, guano wasn't just mortarette, was magical insurance. Imagine a weary guard, halfway through his shift, carefully dotting the edge of a window frame with guano paste, while muttering a protection chant. He believes in the strength of the stone. Sure, but a little supernatural help never hurt. You pause again now, at the base of a tower, where both bees and bats have left their mark. There's an old, sealed nook with wax drips, long hardened, and above it, a faint discoloration from guano. 2 different kingdoms, 2 different wings, both quietly essential. It's strange, isn't it? In a place built for war, survival came not only from swords and shields, but from creatures the size of your hand, from hives hidden in stone, from the hush of flapping wings at dusk, from the flicker of candlelight on golden honey, not just beasts of burden, but allies, unwitting soldiers in a 1,000-year campaign to outlast time. You've climbed again up narrow, spiraling steps whose rhythm makes your calves burn and your thoughts drift. At the top is a small, square chamber, part attic, part storage, part accidental aviary. You pause at the threshold, peering into the low gloom where half-broken crates and dust-heavy tapestries gather. But what draws your attention are the tools: a straw hat, a curved knife, and something that looks like a hooded veil. This, dear listener, was once the domain of the royal beekeeper. Every sizable estate had someone who served as the guardian of the hives, sometimes a monk, sometimes a servant, occasionally, in wealthier courts, a full-time apiarist who received wages, winter cloaks, and even a small house by the orchard walls, all to keep the bees alive, producing, and loyal. Yes, loyal. We'll come back to that. The tools are simple, but clever. A smoker fashioned from leather bellows in a clay dish, used to puff calming smoke into the hive before collecting honey. A dull blade, for trimming wax. A skep hook to lift the straw domes. A pouch of linen scraps soaked in herbs, lavender, sage. Sometimes even crushed juniper to soothe the bees, or, some said, to keep evil spirits from spoiling the honey. And of course, the veil. Thin, layered linen, with a mesh front, tied snugly under the chin. It made the beekeeper look a bit like a ghost, or a nun, or maybe both. This beekeeper didn't just gather honey. They tended the bees like family. They sang to them. They whispered updates about the estate. When the lord went off to war, the bees were informed. When a birth occurred, the hives were told. And if a death happened, the bees were officially mourned with. This wasn't fantasy. This was telling the bees a ritual found in parts of medieval England and France. Some believed that if the bees weren't told of a major life event, they would abandon the hive or stop producing. So imagine the beekeeper standing solemnly before the hives, gently tapping the wood and announcing, "Lady Elsbeth has passed." The household is in grief. Historians still argue whether this was pagan hangover, religious practice, or just rural tradition. But either way, the bees were kept in the loop. But let's not forget the Batman, not the superhero, sadly, but the castle's resident bat wrangler. No, it wasn't always an official title, but in many castles, someone was stuck with the job of clearing out the rafters, scooping guano, and relocating overpopulated bat clusters when they got too cozy. In the guest wing. In monasteries, it was often the younger novices. In noble houses, a lowly steward, frequently muttering under his breath, His tools were more improvised. A long-handled net, a pair of gloves, a bucket, and curiously a small book of psalms, because many believed bats were spirits in disguise, and catching one required more than just speed. It required moral clarity. There's even a surviving instruction from a 13th century castle steward's manual. Should bats gather overmuch in the rafters of the chapel, pray aloud and use lemon balm oil upon the beams to turn them away. Lemon balm, holy verses. Buckets, welcome to medieval pest control. You walk now toward a half-open chest tucked under the eaves. Inside a bundle of scrolls and a tiny stitched pouch when you open it. The smell hits instantly. Dried beeswax, sweet and faintly herbal. This was a balm, likely used by the beekeeper for cracked hands. Days spent near the hives were physically demanding, lifting heavy scaps, hauling honeycomb, dodging the occasional aggressive drone, and it wasn't a safe job. Beekeepers were stung a lot. Records from noble estates sometimes mention a swelling, illness or the red humors in association with apiarists, probably allergic reactions, though no one called them that then. Some unlucky souls developed infections. Others had tales of hallucinations after too many stings. One famously eccentric beekeeper in Brittany claimed he could hear the bees whisper prophecy. He was, unsurprisingly, reassigned to the garden, yet there was reverence, too. The beekeeper was more than a honey harvester. He or she was a sort of alchemist, turning the chaos of insects into gold. Bees were associated with purity, diligence, and divine order. Many churches compared the structure of a beehive to the moral structure of heaven and bats. They were the chaotic cousins of this celestial system. Where bees stood for order, bats symbolized mystery. They appeared in dreams. In medieval bestiaries, bats were sometimes listed alongside demons, not as demons themselves, but as their scouts. Their presence was seen as a warning, but at the same time, they were respected for their service to the household, like an irritable uncle who eats your mosquitoes, and some castles even blessed their bats, no joke. One rural noblewoman, Countess Marjorie of Glomisons, insisted on a bat blessing every spring. The local priest would read a short liturgy from the tower stairs, asking that the bats cleanse the castle of crawling things and keep safe our silks. It's either deeply spiritual or passive-aggressive linen maintenance. You sit now on the edge of the open chest, holding a lump of beeswax between your fingers. It's still faintly pliable after all these centuries. It would have been molded by hand, stored in cool corners, sometimes even traded for spices or cloth. 1 ounce of good wax could buy a day's bread. More, if it was perfumed, and imagine the conversations between the beekeeper and the bat steward, two unlikely allies in the strange maintenance of castle life. One harvesting sweetness, the other managing shadow. Maybe they traded tips. Try thyme oil, the beekeeper says, handing over a wax-wrapped packet. Keeps the little flappers out of the kitchens. Only if you take my guano for your herb beds, the bat handler replies, wiping his hands with a grimace. It's fresh. This was the ecosystem beneath the nobility, the wings that beat behind the banners, the creatures that kept the walls clean and the candles lit. You close the chest gently, the lid creaking like a yawn. Above you, a bat flutters once, then resettles outside the window slit. The sun is sliding west, and you imagine, in some corner of the castle, the beekeeper is checking the hives, while the steward mutters to a passing bat, like an old friend. Two quiet figures, two kinds of caretakers, and behind them, the castle breathes. You leave the attic room behind, descending again into the living chambers of the Keepa, softer part of the castle, if such a thing exists. Tapestries line the walls now, their threads muted by time. The scent of lavender hangs faint in the air, trying its best to mask something more earthy. You're entering the world of noble ritual, where hygiene was aspirational, perfumes were powerful political tools, and if something smelled nice, it probably had either bees or bats to thank for it. The medieval noble didn't bathe often, at least not by modern standards, but when they did, they made it count. Imagine a grand copper tub dragged in front of the hearth, steam rising in coils, while a servant pours a mixture of warm milk, rose water, and honey into the bath. Beeswax candles flicker around the edges of the room, their scent subtle but sweet. This wasn't indulgence, it was status. Honey baths were for the rich, and not just for cleansing. They were believed to soften the skin, preserve youth, and according to one 14th century beauty manual, stir the blood toward affection. Translation: it was the medieval version of setting the mood. Some of the recipes were alarmingly elaborate. Honey mixed with goat's milk, mashed quince, and a touch of lemon balm. Others, more medical, added crushed mint, salt, and wine. Historians still argue whether these blends had any real dermatological effect, or just made you smell like a half-drunken dessert. But here's the kicker. While honey was the star of luxury, bad guano snuck its way into some surprisingly intimate places to dot. No, not into the bathwater though. Someone, somewhere, probably tried it. Instead, it found its way into poultices, face masks, and even ointments meant to restore vigor or cure facial discoloration. One infamous Italian remedy from the 1300s involves guano mixed with olive oil and powdered silver, applied nightly to remove the pallor of sorrow. So yes, bat poop as medieval concealer. You move into a lady's dressing chamber now. A faint breeze tugs at the drapes open slightly, just wide enough for a bat to sneak in, and some did. In fact, there are records of bat-related mishaps during grooming. A French countess once insisted her hair became tangled with a sleeping bat after she left it loose near an open window. The incident became castle gossip for weeks. The blend of bat and bee didn't stop at grooming, it extended to perfume. The bees provided the base. Honey absolute, a thick, sticky scent drawn from the comb. Bats, well, their contribution wasn't direct, but their guano, rich in certain ammonia-like compounds, was sometimes burned to cleanse a room before fresh herbs were laid down to scent the air. Like medieval Febreze, if Febreze were horrifying, you run your hand over a carved wooden box near the vanity. Inside, tiny clay jars with hardened remnants. One smells faintly sweet, another sharp, like crushed mint. These were the ingredients of allure: honey mixed with orange blossom, beeswax blended with crushed cloves and myrrh. Some noblewomen used beeswax to sculpt their hair into towering shapes, or to seal curls into place. It wasn't hairspray, but it worked well enough. Until summer. There's a delightful tale of a summer feast, where a lady's waxed coiffure began to melt under the heat of too many torches, leaving slow drips trailing down her neck like golden tears. No word on whether the bees tried to reclaim it. And speaking of warmth, fireplaces were both a comfort and a curse. They drew bats, especially during cooler months, when the flapping guests would tumble down chimneys and swoop through supper without invitation. Some households hung herbs near hearths to repel them. Rosemary and mugwort were favorites. One superstition claimed that hanging a dead bee in the chimney would keep bats out. Oddly specific and deeply unsettling. Yet, despite the accidents and the aroma, the creatures stayed, because they worked. They cleaned the air. They ate the pests. They pollinated the gardens and fertilized the herbs. They were, in a strange way, cleaners of chaos, quiet contributors to the comfort and power of the ruling class, and they inspired art, too. You gaze now at a tapestry half draped over a wardrobe. It's faded, but you can make out a central figure, maybe, a goddess or queen framed by birds and flowers. But tucked into the corner, stitched in a darker thread, is a bat. Tiny, deliberate, a reminder that even in beauty, there is shadow. In the margins of medieval manuscripts, bees appear as symbols of wisdom, of order, of divine femininity. Bats, meanwhile, hover in the realms of mystery, fear, or transformation. You imagine a bored monk doodling a bat on the edge of a psalter, just to see if anyone notices. Someone always did. And in the minds of castle dwellers, these animals became metaphors: bees for control, bats for what lay just beyond it. Even now, you can picture it. A nobleman sitting for a portrait, bees embroidered on his doublet to show discipline and industry. A lady with a carved comb shaped like wings. A steward placing a wax seal on a letter shaped like a bat to signal secrecy. This castle, you realize, wasn't just filled with buzz and flap. It was filled with symbolism. These creatures weren't pests. They were part of the narrative, part of the brand, if you like. And as you turn, heading back toward the main hall, the light catches on something unexpected: a polished hand mirror. Its back is inlaid with gold, and they're etched so small, you almost miss it is a bee surrounded by tiny stars. Whoever owned this mirror wanted to see their reflection encircled by symbols of sweetness and power. Not a bad legacy, really. Back in the grand corridor now, you walk slower. Everything is dimmer, more hushed. The light slants in through a distant window slit, catching particles in the air like flecks of gold dust. It's hard to tell whether it's early morning or late afternoon. Time blurs in castles like this. You enter a chamber with a low ceiling and stone benches built into the walls. This room smells stronger than the others. Not unpleasant, but earthy, sharp, and herbal. You've found the apothecary, or perhaps the closest thing a medieval castle had to one. This space part science lab, part superstition cavis, where medicine was made, or guessed at. And wouldn't you know it, our winged friends make yet another appearance here too. Let's begin with the bees again. Honey, of course, was the MVP of medieval medicine. It wasn't just a sweetener, it was antibacterial, antiseptic, and shelf-stable. Bee-based remedies fill old medical texts like guest stars on a long-running sitcom. A deep cut, pack it with honey-soaked linen, sore throat, swallow a spoonful, mixed with thyme and wine, aching joints, massage with warmed honey and powdered juniper. There's even a 12th century recipe involving honey, ash, and fish oil meant to cure numbness of the legs, which probably cured nothing but did make you smell unforgettable. In one far corner of this room, under a dusty cloth, lies a box of beeswax molds. These weren't just for candles. Beeswax was used to seal jars of medicine, to coat pills, even to form temporary dental plugs. One manuscript describes how to shape wax into a false tooth, press it into place, and then pray the Lord would keep it from falling out during supper. And then there were the bee myths. Some believed that honey harvested during a full moon had more healing power. Others thought bees whispered cures to those who listened closely. At least one medieval healer claimed to have received dream visions from the bee queen, who taught her how to heal fevers using only honey, moss, and rainwater. Historians still argue whether these visions were divine inspiration or the result of inhaling a bit too much wax smoke. Now, let's fly over to the darker corner of the room. There sits, beneath a cracked stone vent, beside a shelf of dried herbs, is a wide ceramic jar with a lid painted in rough black script. Guano Kakata. Blessed guano. Yes. It's the bats again. You suppress a grimace and gently lift the lid. Inside, a powdery gray substance that smells a bit like roasted hay and regret. This wasn't just compost. It was medicine. Sort of. Bat guano appears in more medical texts than anyone would like to admit. It was applied topically for swelling, brewed into teas for kidney problems, and even ground into pastes meant to draw out toxins of the mind. That's right, guano was medieval anti-anxiety balm. The logic, if you can call it that, was simple. Bats were nocturnal, mysterious, and naturally resistant to disease, or so they thought. Anything that lived in darkness and stayed healthy must hold some secret power. So, by medieval logic, Ingesting their droppings just transferred that power. Medicine was like a chooser and misadventure game back then. And then there's the case of the beekeeper's curse. You walk toward a smaller alcove, where a cracked wooden box sits beneath a heavy cloth. The box is labeled in old, fading ink with a single word, Benedictus, a name. According to scattered records and much castle gossip, Benedictus was once the royal beekeeper of a northern manor. Wise, quiet, and oddly pale, he was said to keep to himself, always speaking softly to his bees and sleeping in a room without doors. One day, all the bees vanished. The next day, so did he. What remained? Just a jar of blackened honey and a scroll of warnings. The tale varies, depending on who tells it. Some say he made a pact with spirits, trading his bees for knowledge. Others claim a rival poisoned the hives out of jealousy. One version suggests he was stung so many times in a single night that he merged with the hive, becoming one with the queen. It's probably nonsense, but the scrolls describe the Benedictus blend, a honey salve that could supposedly heal plague sores overnight. Tor cursed the user with whispering dreams. That salve, it was made with honey, willow bark, and a pinch of bat guano. Even now, you can feel the walls lean in slightly, like they're listening, unless you think these are the only eccentricities. Let's talk about the beekeeper's tongue remedy, a concoction believed to restore lost speech. The ingredients: 1 teaspoon of honey, a sliver of batwing. Don't ask the dew from a thistle leaf. A prayer to Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of toothaches. The mixture was rubbed onto the tongue, while the afflicted chanted a rhyme that, loosely translated, went from wing to sting. May sound now spring. Weirdly poetic. Definitely ineffective. You brush your hand along the edge of the table. It's sticky in places, rough in others. Dried herbs hang in bundles above you: sage, fennel, valerian, and, beneath them, a small brazier, where salves were once heated gently over coals. The bees and bats may be gone now, but their legacy lingers in the room's very walls. In the end, medieval medicine wasn't always rational, but it was resourceful. People used what they had: wings, wax, droppings, dreams, and often that meant turning to the natural world, even its strangest corners. You exit the apothecary slowly, leaving behind its bittersweet scent. Outside the doorway, the corridor waits in silence. But now, every flutter you hear seems like a whisper of wisdom or warning. And maybe, just maybe, if you listen closely, you'll hear a buzz or a flap, or a whisper that tastes faintly of honey and ash. You're walking now beneath a high timbered ceiling, the beams arched above like the ribs of a sleeping beast. This space feels older than the rest of the castle. Dust motes drift lazily through the air, stirred only by the slow whisper of your footsteps. It's neither day nor night. Exactly, the light is thin and non-committal, like it's not sure if it wants to stay. This was once the great hall, the heart of castle life. Now it's mostly empty, quiet, but not truly still, because up in the beams, if you tilt your head just slightly, you'll see them, hanging in uneven rows like forgotten fruit. Bats, so many bats. You blink once, twice, you count maybe 10, 20, no more. They sway gently, wings wrapped tight against their bodies, each one a small velvet pouch of sleep. This is the castle's night shift, all resting before their rounds begin. Back in the day, this room would have been filled with chatter and clatter, feasts, dancing, rushed footsteps, barked orders. But even then, the bats were there watching, probably judging. Definitely POOPING. And here's the thing, no one really cared, because in a world where rats roamed freely, chamber pots were dumped from windows, and fleas were a near certainty, bats were practically elegant. They flitted, they hovered, they feasted on the bugs that feasted on you. Some noble households actually encouraged them. One 15th century record describes A nobleman who installed perches of soft beam beneath the roof to welcome bats into the hall. His reason: let the flying dusk eat what stings the skin. A poetic way of saying, please, eat all my biting insects. And eat, they did. One adult bat can consume hundreds of insects in a single night. Multiply that by a colony, and you've got nature's most efficient extermination service. No fees, no complaints, just fluttering efficiency. The castle cook likely adored them. Fewer flies meant cleaner meat. The washerwomen were grateful. No more moths nibbling the linens. Even the scribes probably offered a silent thank you when their manuscripts didn't end up crawling with silverfish. Still, there were complications. Let's talk about the guano situation. You walk to the edge of the hall, where a faded wool rug covers a patch of uneven stone. Beneath it, evidence. A dark, crusted layer, paper-thin, but unmistakable. Bat droppings. They fell in. Slow, regular drizzles from the rafters above, accumulating like secret snow. This wasn't just a cleaning problem. It was a smell problem. Hence, the invention of bat boxes. Small, enclosed ledges where the creatures could roost, separated slightly from the main beams. The idea was to encourage the bats to cluster in designated areas so that droppings could be swept more easily. Sometimes, the guano was even collected on purpose. As we've learned, bat poop had many uses. Fertilizer medicinal. Salvis, magical warding paste. At one point, guano was even powdered into a fine dust and mixed with crushed bone to create a floor polish that shone like moonlight, and supposedly dispelled bad humors. Historians still argue whether this recipe worked or just gave people shiny floors that smelled like a forest fire. Now let's shift your gaze to the torch sconces along the walls. Most are long cold. A few still hold half-melted stubs of beeswax, candles pale gold, twisted, and a bit dusty. These weren't for show. They were functional, ritualistic, and deeply symbolic. In fact, there were designated candle placements for feast days, births, and even celestial events. During eclipses, some castles would light every beeswax candle in the keep, believing the sun had been swallowed, and only light born of bees could coax it back. Superstition, sure, but in the flickering glow, with shadows dancing over the stone, it probably felt right, and every candle had a story. One may have been made from the first wax of spring, a good omen. Another, from the final harvest hive, used only during funerals. Some had herbs woven into them: bay leaves, cloves, mugwort, to ward off illness or bad luck. In this hall, under this ceiling, those candles once lit weddings, treaties, duels. The wax dripped onto polished tables, into goblets, onto scrolls. And somewhere above it all, bats blinked slowly in the dark, unimpressed by it all. You settle on a bench now, your back against cool stone. You watch the ceiling, and in the stillness, one bat stirs. It stretches a wing thin and veined, like delicate leather, then settles again. The motion is almost elegant. No sound, just the faint suggestion of movement. It's funny, you think, how these animals became part of the castle's rhythm, like distant servants, unseen, but essential. They had no names, no titles, but they were here in the rafters, in the stories, in the shadows. And let's not forget the midnight myths. Every old castle had a tale or two about the bat who listened, a creature so old it had seen generations pass. Some said it whispered secrets to those who couldn't sleep. Others claimed it led children safely back to bed after nightmares. One legend tells of a dying knight who saw a bat hovering beside his candle and swore it was the soul of his long-dead brother, come to carry him home. Again, who knows? The line between myth and history blurs in places like this, but if you sit long enough, as you are now, you start to understand why these stories took root. It's the quiet, the wings, the unshakable feeling that something is always just out of sight but never far. You exhale. The room is still again. Only the bats move, in slow, dreamlike shifts above. The candles are gone. The feast's ended. The war's finished. But the flapping in the rafters remains. And somehow, that's comforting. Because long after the lords have vanished, the buzz has faded, and the banners have fallen. The bats are still here, watching, waiting, keeping the night. You leave the great hall behind, passing once more through familiar corridors, the ones where bees hummed in hidden alcoves, and bats slept in forgotten rafters. Your footsteps echo quietly now, more memory than sound. The castle seems gentler, somehow, less a fortress, more a hushed companion. You descend a short staircase, and enter what might once have been a storeroom, or maybe a quiet retreat for scribes and stewards. Now it's empty except for dust, one cracked stool, and the soft scent of wax in the air. This is where it ends. Not with fanfare, but with whispers. The last quiet corners. The fading echoes of lives once lived with wings overhead and honey in hand. You crouch beside a patch of flagstone where the mortar has darkened moisture, perhaps, or a spill, long since forgotten. But at the edge, you notice something. A faint, glimmering trail. Sticky, golden, hardened. It's honey, trapped in the creases of time. A ghost of sweetness. Perhaps it leaked from a pot once dropped. Maybe. A servant tried to clean it and gave up. Or maybe, just maybe it was left there on purpose. A trace, a ritual, a memory left for someone to find. You dip your finger gently into the groove and bring it close. It smells faintly of herbs, lavender, sage, thyme, a thousand moments sealed in golden resin, and just beside it 3 tiny black smudges on the wall. Guano, dry, crumbly, unremarkable, unless you know what to look for, which you do now. This castle has seen everything. War, feasts, betrayals, weddings. It has echoed with laughter and prayer and silence. But beneath all of that, in the margins, in the tucked-away places, there were always wings. There was the bee that flew through the chapel during morning prayers and landed on the altar like a sleepy saint. There was the bat that swooped through the dining hall and landed in a tureen of parsnip soup, causing a baroness to faint into her husband's lap. There were the keepers, quiet, careful, a little strange, who spent their lives tending hives and sweeping rafters, speaking softly to creatures that most others swatted away. And there were the myths. You remember the beekeeper's curse now, whispered in that apothecary alcove, or the tale of the bat who returned every winter to the same spot above the prince's cradle, long after the prince had died. And maybe you're thinking, surely these stories can't all be true. They probably aren't. But here's a secret. They don't have to be. In a castle like this, truth and tale live side by side, like bees in a comb, separate, but stuck together by something golden. Now, for the final strange pairing, some nobles believed that honey and guanoyes really win, combined in specific ratios, and blessed under the new moon, created a potion of truth. It was thick, bitter, and likely horrifying, but they swore by it. A single spoonful, and lies would burn in the mouth. Servants were made to sip it before important confessions. No wonder loyalty was so complex. Historians still argue whether this was superstition, or just an elaborate excuse to keep the castle's bees and bats on the payroll. Either way, it's a legacy, a peculiar one, but a real one. You stand now at the edge of the castle grounds. There's a courtyard out here, overgrown, mossy, but the outlines remain. Stone troughs where hives once stood, rusted brackets where lanterns once burned, a tiny wooden door, half swallowed by ivy, perhaps once leading to the bat closet, mentioned in that record from centuries past. It's silent, except for the wind, but if you close your eyes, you can almost hear it again. The low hum, the flutter, the ancient chorus of wings, small and steady, keeping time with the castle's Heartbeat, the bees are long gone. The bats have found new rafters. But their story remains, stitched into the stone, sealed in wax, scattered in dust. They were never the lords or ladies. They never wore crowns. But in their own quiet, buzzing, flapping way, they helped hold this world together. And that is enough now. The light has gone soft, and the last echoes of the castle fade into the hush of your room. The wings have stilled. The bees are asleep. Even the dust seems to have settled into silence. You breathe slowly, deeply, letting the strangeness of this old world dissolve into something quieter, softer, safer. The stone walls that once held whispers and wing beats now hold only stillness. There are no more footsteps in the corridor, no rustle from the rafters, just a deep, abiding calm. You imagine the last of the candles burning low. Their golden light flickers across empty tapestries, casting long, sleepy shadows on ancient stone. A breeze drifts in through a high-slit window, carrying the scent of faded herbs and old wax. And somewhere, far off, a single bat folds its wings and settles into the hush. You're part of this now, a guest in the memory of a place where honey and guano once meant survival. And the smallest creatures held the greatest mysteries. The world outside your walls has slowed. Your body is heavier now, your breath quieter, and in your mind, the castle drifts into dream. Not grand, not haunted, just gently alive, and finally, still. So rest, now let the wings fade, let the stone go cold, and let sleep find yous, wheat, and slows, it always does. End of script. Sweet dreams.